Well, good evening and welcome to the Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise's first spring semester event. I'm Glenn Moots, professor and director of the Forum. Can you hear me okay? Good. Is it all the way to the back? Good. Good. Thank you. Well, please join me in silencing your device. Check mine here too. And also, let me draw your attention, we have two back tables. One is a sign-up sheet where you can provide your email address, and that will enable me to keep you abreast of the additional activities for the semester. There are also some flyers. They look like this, and they also list all of our activities for the semester. And you're more than welcome to take one of those and put it on your refrigerator, or give some to your neighbors, or put them up at your favorite coffee shop. And if you spread the word, we'd be very much in your debt. As you look at the list of upcoming events, you'll notice we have a very diverse lineup. On February 9th, we begin a 3-part lecture series titled The Great Society at 50. It's now been 50 years of the Great Society, not to mention 80 years of the New Deal. And we have 3 very qualified speakers who will address whether or not the welfare state has succeeded. And at the risk of spoiling it for you, I think the answer is mostly no. Whether or not we're stuck with programs like the Great Society and what alternatives exist. And that series is co-sponsored by the Institute for Humane Studies. On March 2nd, another co-sponsored event with the Institute for Humane Studies, we'll have a debate between 2 heavyweights, Max Boot and Doug Bandow, on the question of American military involvement in the Middle East. That will be in Griswold Lecture Hall, by the way. On March 31st, we'll have William C. Davis, who is a prolific and award-winning author here, and he'll help us celebrate the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. Professor Davis has written a remarkable examination of the lives of Lee and Grant that was just published this month, and getting an historian of Mr. Davis's stature is certainly a coup for us, and we hope that you'll join us on March 31st. Note, by the way, if you pick up one of these, or if you get my emails, or if you just look around campus, you'll notice that we take advantage of 2 other venues for our programs, the Gerace Auditorium in the Turf Building, and also the Griswold Lecture Hall. I'm sure you know where that is. Now, while it's easy to focus on the big public policies and the big historical events, we're tempted to overlook literature, a critical part of training for both citizenship and enterprise, and that explains our program tonight. Recent research in cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience all argue that reading fiction, especially the kind we'll discuss tonight, makes us both smarter and more empathetic. It activates our brain towards sensory detail and moral complexity, and enhances both spoken and written communication. And it's just plain fun. Of course, we are cheating a bit with this presentation, insofar as many of you may be here because of Peter Jackson's 6 films. If so, that's fine too. And however many liberties Jackson took with the story, we'll forgive him because it's nice to see a Tolkien revival. And tonight our speaker is Dr. Ben Lockhart. Dr. Lockhart is professor of English at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, where he was also director of the Master of Arts program until 2011. He's received the Grand Valley State University Alumni Association's Outstanding Educator Award and the Honors College Outstanding Faculty Member Award. His Master of Arts degree is from the University of Toronto, and he holds a PhD from the University of Connecticut. In addition to a number of published essays on Renaissance subjects and T.S. Eliot, he's the author of 2 books, one on Spencer and one on Eliot. He's also editor of a collection of essays on T.S. Eliot and the Christian tradition. He also wrote the introduction to the most recent edition of Russell Kirk's Eliot and His Age, and is on board of the Russell Kirk Center, which is down the road, loosely speaking, in Mecosta, Michigan. He's also served as president of the T.S. Eliot Society. He and his wife, who's joining us tonight, have 5 children and 7 grandchildren, and I have a pretty good hunch that they're worth more to him than all the books and all the lectures in the world. Dr. Lockhart was with us a few years ago and joined us, our own Jeff Phillips and Peter Skockel from Hope College for a panel on C.S. Lewis. Now, Ben has told me that he plans to speak for about 35 minutes, mainly talking about the shadowy evil part of our program, and then he'd like to segue into a discussion with you about the unlikely heroes part. and then we'll also have time for Q&A. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Ben Locker.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the C.S. Lewis discussion a few years ago. How many people were here for that? Anybody? Okay, some anyway. And I was pleased to be asked back. I've been a Tolkien fan for decades, and but not really a Tolkien scholar, so I was glad to have the opportunity to dig into it in a little bit different way. Of course, it should be fun, but this lecture is not going to be fun. We murder to dissect, Wordsworth says somewhere. And now I think it'll still be somewhat fun, but it is a heavy topic, evil, in Tolkien. There are two fundamental notions of evil. Followers of the viewpoint called dualism believe that there is a good God and an evil God, the two more or less equally balanced in an eternal struggle. In the early days of Christianity, this idea was promoted most prominently by a teacher called Mani, whose many followers were called Manichaeans. St. Augustine himself was for a time a Manichaean, but then became its most eloquent opponent. The alternative idea to dualism is that there is only one God who is all-powerful and all-good. He created everything in the cosmos, and all that he created is good, for he would never create anything evil. This understanding of good and evil is the only one compatible with Christianity, and it was proclaimed by early church councils as the orthodox belief, while Manichaean ideas and other dualistic approaches were declared heretical. The problem confronting the Orthodox theologian is that evil plainly does exist in our world. If God created everything and everything was good, how did evil come about? All Orthodox theologians have been in agreement as to the answer, which begins with the statement that evil is not a created thing at all. Rather, it is the absence of being, the privation of being, as Augustine says. God created some beings with free will, angels, humans, and they were able to choose to turn away from good. When they did so, they were not turning towards some other being, but turning away from the source of all being. St. Augustine said famously that evil is an absence of good, and which means at the same time an absence of being. This idea is readily understood if you just think about darkness, which is not something but an absence of light, or if you think about cold, which is not something, though in January in Michigan it can feel like a malevolent force, to be sure. But it isn't. It's just an absence of heat. According to this explanation, when a being with free will turns away from the good, that being turns toward nothingness, and his, her, or her own being is impaired. Satan, in attempting to take the place of God, did much harm to himself and to those who followed him. But he did not become more powerful, ultimately. Instead, his being diminished as his goodness diminished. He and his minions are still able to do tremendous damage, but they are becoming ever less in the ultimate scheme of things and have taken nothing away from the power or being of God. This understanding of evil has important implications, one that Christian writers have embodied in their fictional works. And this evening we're going to think about some of the ways in which these principles appear in the writings of Tolkien. If evil is a privation of good, then one who chooses evil is corrupted and becomes less what he was meant to be by the Creator. Yet no being can become entirely evil, for complete evil would entail a complete absence of being, and the creature would simply cease to exist. One of the most profound works based on this idea is Dante's Divine Comedy. And I would like to mention this work before turning to Tolkien. I don't think he would object to being behind Dante. In describing hell, Dante does something surprising. He envisions the deeper levels of Inferno. So one time, a friend of mine said, Tolkien was a greater writer than Shakespeare. And I said, I wish I had Tolkien here right now. He would laugh at you. He would say, of course, I'm not a greater writer than Shakespeare. But he's a very great writer. Anyway, Dante does something really interesting in Inferno. Instead of things getting hotter as you go down into deeper levels of hell and meet sinners who've committed worse sins, it gets colder until at the bottom the sinners are frozen up to their necks in ice. The idea behind this for Dante is exactly this notion of evil, that evil is an absence of warmth, an absence of heat, an absence of love, finally. And love moves everything in the universe. So finally you get down to Satan himself at the very bottom of the pit. He's also frozen in the ice. His great wings are barely moving, for he has so little goodness and being left that he can hardly move at all. Yet he still exists. Satan has lost nearly all the angelic intelligence he was given at his creation. He cannot even speak. And he uses his 3 mouths only to chew on 3 vile sinners. His demonic servants are seen as being active in the world by Dante, tempting men to sin. But they are all much diminished in their being, and are certainly no match for the good angels who used to be their fellows, much less for God himself. And I think one thing that's particularly interesting is Satan's loss of intelligence. He doesn't even have the ability to speak anymore in Dante's conception. All right, now we're ready to turn to Tolkien. Like Dante, he assumes that even the most corrupt person must have a little bit of good left, or he would cease to exist at all. We see that Gollum, for instance, is just a shadow of his former self. We are told that he was originally a small, wholesome creature, much like the Hobbits, until he stole the ring and became its master, or rather, its servant. When we first meet him in The Hobbit, he is wasted away, becoming a sneaky, furtive little monster who has sought the darkest hole he could find under the mountains, retreating further and further away from the light, and becoming less and less what he was originally meant to be. His new name, Gollum, is merely the horrible sound he makes in his throat. And I'm feeling a little bit like Gollum myself tonight because a cold got me just a couple of days ago. His mind has wasted away so that his speech is broken. Bilbo's riddle about the sun shining on daisies is a common one, but almost stumps Gollum, who has avoided the sun for many years. And Tolkien writes, these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty. Yet even at the end of The Lord of the Rings, there is still some good in him. And in the presence of Frodo, his old self, Smeagol, resurfaces at times, arguing with his Gollum self. Frodo sparks this change by calling him Smeagol and freeing him from the elven rope which burns him. And the narrator says, from that moment, a change which lasted for some time came over him. He spoke with less hissing and whining, and he spoke to his companions direct, not to his precious self. When Frodo falls asleep while taking his turn to be on guard, Sam wakes and sees Gollum hovering over him. Gollum was talking to himself. Smeagol was holding a debate with some other thought that used the same voice, but made it squeak and hiss. A pale light and a green light alternated in his eyes as he spoke. And the movies play this up a lot, but it is in the text in this way. This is the inner debate between the small remnant of the good self and the dominant bad self, who does win the debate finally and determines to take Frodo and Sam to Shelob. Just before Gollum takes them into her lair, as the hobbits are again both sleeping, Smeagol makes his last appearance. Gollum looked at them. A strange expression passed over his lean, hungry face. The gleam faded from his eyes, and they went dim and gray, old and tired. A spasm of pain seemed to twist him, and he turned away, peering back up towards the past, shaking his head as if engaged in some interior debate. Then he came back, and slowly putting out a trembling hand, very cautiously he touched Frodo's knee. But almost the touch was a caress. This is the last slight movement of love in the shriveled heart of a creature committed to greed and selfishness and murder. There is yet a little good left in Smeagol, even now. The ring becomes a symbol of the temptation to power and to pride that is at the root of all sin. It cannot be used by the forces of good to overthrow evil, because it would corrupt whoever wore it. Indeed, I was talking to my son about this, and he said, it seems as if the good forces never send their A-team in. They always send somebody who's just barely able to fight the fight. When they've got, where's Glorfindel? Where's Glorfindel when you need him? He could clean up on Sauron in a minute. So I think that's true. The good is always seems to be fighting with one hand behind its back. Anyway, they can't wear the ring because it would corrupt them. In the council where they must decide what to do with it, Elrond says they must attempt to destroy it. He says, if any of the wise should with this ring overthrow the Lord of Mordor, using his own arts, he would then set himself on Sauron's throne, and yet another dark lord would appear. And that is the reason why the ring should be destroyed. As long as it is in the world, it will be a danger, even to the wise. For nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. Nothing is evil in the beginning. Here Tolkien has Elrond enunciate that one key principle. All beings were created good. Evil is not a separate entity, but a corruption of good creatures. Tolkien presents many examples of good creatures who have been corrupted by evil. The ring wraiths are described as being so dark that they are blacker than the night itself. So black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them, like black holes. Though they are certainly powerful, they are so evil that they barely exist. After his first terrible encounter with them, Frodo notices that though only he, wearing the ring, could see the wraiths themselves, all the hobbits could see the horses. Just as the black robes, and Aragorn explains that, because they are real horses. Just as the black robes are real robes that they wear to give shape to their nothingness when they have dealings with the living. Once great men, they are, at some basic level, almost nothing now, though, again, still wielding great power. Similarly, the mighty Balrog, the powerful being in the mines of Moria, who is almost too much even for Gandalf, is really a shadow of himself. Here's the description. The ranks of the orcs had opened, and they crowded away, as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man-shape maybe, yet greater. And a power and terror seemed to be in it and to go before it. Now the Balrogs were originally angelic beings called Maiar, as were the wizards Saruman, Gandalf, Radagast. But the Balrogs joined with Melkor, the Satan figure, who's the first to break away from God. It is no surprise then that this Balrog is a match for Gandalf, who is a being of the same order. Yet this corrupted Maya is a great shadow, and shadows have no substance. It wields power through fear, but it has not the substance of its original being. When Gandalf confronts it, he commands it to go back to the shadow. This is not merely the shadow at the heart of the mountain, but the spiritual darkness in which this angelic being has chosen to live. And we hear, the Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. There is a similar emphasis in the description of the Dark Lord's searching eye, which Frodo first sees in the mirror of Galadriel. But suddenly the mirror went altogether dark as if a hole had opened in the world of sight. And Frodo looked into emptiness. In the black abyss there appeared a single eye that slowly grew until it filled nearly all the mirror. So terrible was it that Frodo stood rooted, unable to cry out or to withdraw his gaze. The eye was rimmed with fire, but was itself glazed yellow as a cat's, watchful and intent. And the black slit of its pupil opened on a pit, a window into nothing. The eye appears out of a vast darkness. Frodo finds himself looking into emptiness, for evil is empty, a black abyss. Though the outer part of the eye is yellow and is rimmed with fire, the center is a pit. The eye is a window to the soul, but this eye is a window into nothing. As Saruman follows Sauron into this darkness, his eyes become empty too. And Treebeard describes him to Merry and Pippin thus: there was a time when he was always walking about my woods. He was polite in those days, always asking my leave, at least when he met me, and always eager to listen. I told him many things that he would never have found out by himself, but he never repaid me in like kind. I cannot remember that he ever told me anything. And he got more and more like that. His face, as I remember it, I have not seen it for many a day, became like windows in a stone wall, windows with shutters inside. So his eyes, too, have become dark. Treebeard gradually became aware that Saruman was using him for his own purposes. There was no exchange in their relationship, no reciprocity, no friendship, certainly. And as Saruman continued to keep all he learned from the old imp to himself, hoarding that knowledge, his eyes, like Sauron's eye, became darkened windows, shuttered to the world, so as to protect his knowledge and hide his intentions. His eyes, too, became empty and dark. At the end of the story, Saruman has lost nearly all of his power and is reduced to doing some small evil back in the Shire, out of a malicious desire for revenge on hobbits. But even those plots are foiled, and then Saruman tries to stab Frodo. Sam draws his sword to kill the wicked sorcerer, but Frodo restrains him, saying, "Do not kill him even now, for he has not hurt me." And in any case, I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind that we should not dare to raise our hands against. He is fallen, and his cure is beyond us, but I would still spare him in the hope that he may find it. Saruman has wasted most of his being, but Frodo spares him out of respect for his original nobility, and in hope that the bit of good still left in him might yet be recovered and renewed. However, the other thing that happens is a being who has corrupted himself becomes less and less capable of repentance. And Saruman responds to this act of mercy with hatred and spite. He turns to Wormtongue, abusing him and kicking him, and Wormtongue suddenly draws out a knife and cuts his throat. The description of this end emphasizes how little good, how little being was left in Saruman. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a gray mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale, shrouded figure, it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking into the west. But out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh, dissolved into nothing. Saruman is perhaps the most sympathetic of the evil characters in the story, next to Gollum at least. For we catch glimpses of his greatness and goodness before he is corrupted by his own lust for power and by the deceits of the Dark Lord. Like Frodo, I think we feel some pity for him when we see him dissolve into nothingness at the end, with so little good left in him that he seems not just to die, but to cease to exist. For the Lord of the Wraiths, on the other hand, we feel no such pity, for he has practically ceased to be human. Gandalf names him King of Angmar long ago, sorcerer, Ringwraith, Lord of the Nazgul, a spear of terror in the hand of Sauron, shadow of despair. So he gets a really good introduction from Gandalf. Notice that he is a spear, a weapon, but a spear of terror, a weapon of terror. And I'm playing with this idea that maybe these evil characters are not all that powerful, but they wield fear and darkness. So his only real power is that of fear and of despair. For Gandalf's last title for him is Shadow of Despair. Shortly after, Gandalf confronts him as he enters the gates of Minas Tirith, ready to conquer. In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, a great black shape against the fires beyond. He loomed up, grown to a vast menace of despair, very similar to the Balrog. Like the Balrog, he looms large over the wizard, but his shape is a shadow. Gandalf commands him, go back to the abyss prepared for you. Go back. Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go. The Black Rider throws back his hood, revealing a crown, and yet upon no head visible was it set. From a mouth unseen there came a deadly laughter. This cold, mirthless laugh of triumph is premature, however, for as he lifts his sword to kill Gandalf, he hears the horns of Rohan blowing and turns to give battle and to meet his end. Okay, part two. One important corollary of the Orthodox understanding of evil is that evil beings cannot create, but can only corrupt what God has created, or else that they can imitate his creations. Corrupt or imitate, but not create themselves. The evil deity of the dualists can make evil creatures and even create an evil world. In fact, most dualists believe that this world is an evil world that was created by the evil God, and that's why it's evil. And some of them go so far as to say you should never have any more children because they're just bringing them into an evil world. But Orthodox Christians, and this is true I think for Jews and Muslims as well, maintain that there is only one God and only he can create anything from nothing. His creations are all good, but can be corrupt. Free-willed beings who have turned to evil corrupt themselves and others. They also sometimes attempt to make other evil beings, but all they can do is to imitate what God has made or corrupt what God has made. Returning just for a second to Dante's Satan, for instance, he's shown with 3 heads, which is an imitation of the Trinity, but a very pathetic and sick imitation. And that's all you can muster. Similarly, the Black Mass is merely a parody of the Mass. We see this principle come into play in Tolkien's creation story, told in the Silmarillion. There, the divine creator, called Eru, the One, first creates angelic beings, called the Ainur, who make music he puts into their minds, music which takes shape in the cosmos. One of the Ainur, Melkor, begins to introduce themes that are discordant, not in line with what the Creator has put forward. Tolkien says that Melkor had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame. For desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. And what he really desires is to be able to do what only God can do, to create. This proud desire is not just an assistant to God in his creation, but another creator. That's the origin of evil. Some of the Ainur go into the new world God's music has created, and among them is Melkor, who declares, "This shall be my kingdom, and I name it unto myself." The other Valar, as they're called, prepare earth, Middle Earth, for the coming of the firstborn, that is the elves, created by Eru. But Melkor tries to destroy their work at every turn. The Valar endeavored ever, in despite of Melkor, to rule the earth and to prepare it for the coming of the firstborn. And they built lands, and Melkor destroyed them. Valleys they delved, and Melkor raised them up. Mountains they carved, and Melkor threw them down. Seas they hollowed, and Melkor spilled them. And naught might have peace or come to lasting growth. For as surely as the Valar began a labor, so would Melkor undo it or corrupt it. Thus we see that Melkor has not been able to achieve his original aim of creating things of his own. Instead, he devotes himself to corrupting what God has created with the assistance of the other Valar. The same is true of all beings who turn to evil. Before we've read very far in the Hobbit, we hear of the terrible dragon who guards the treasure hoard of the dwarves. Of course, Tolkien gets this from Beowulf, his favorite poem, where there's a thief who steals one goblet from a dragon hoard and awakens the wrath of the dragon. Thorin's description emphasizes the fact that dragons cannot make anything. He says, "Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them. And they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value. And they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor." This last detail about a dragon's inability to mend loose scales becomes quite important at the end of the story. But the deeper truth here is that evil creatures are unable to make beautiful things, though they may covet them. Dwarves at their worst are nearly as greedy for gold as a dragon, as we also learn later on. But at their best, they love creating beautiful things with metal and stone more than they love the precious metals and gems themselves. This ability to make useful and lovely objects, or if you are a writer, good stories, to make these from the good things of the world, Tolkien called this sub-creation, by which he meant we cannot create new beings from nothing as God can, but we can make good things with the materials he has given us. And this, the corrupted evil beings are less and less able to do. Saruman, for example, creates a new race of orcs, the Uruk-hai. But this is not a new creation. Treebeard notices that these orcs can endure sunlight and wonders how Saruman has done it. Are they men he has ruined? Or has he blended the races of orcs and men? That would be a black evil. Though it's never really made explicit, as far as I know, it seems that the latter is the explanation. Saruman has crossbred orcs and men. In either case, though, he has not created a new creature, but has only corrupted existing creatures. The original orcs appear to have been either corrupted elves or creatures made by Melkor from the materials deep in the earth in mockery of the elves. When Merry asks whether he will break down the doors of Saruman's tower, Treebeard replies, well, we could, you know. You do not know perhaps how strong we are. Maybe you have heard of trolls. They are mighty strong, but trolls are only counterfeits, made by the enemy in the great darkness in mockery of men's, as orcs were of elves. Melkor can make only horrible and degraded counterfeits, not new creatures. So this idea is made clearer when Sam has freed Frodo from captivity and is concerned, as hobbits always are, with food. He asks, "Don't orcs eat? Don't they drink? Or do they just live on foul air and poison?" And Frodo responds, "No, they eat and drink, Sam. The shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make. Not real new things of its own." I don't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined them and twisted them. And if they are to live at all, they have to live like other living creatures. Here's a wonderfully succinct statement of this truth. The shadow that bred them can only mock, not make. True creation comes from an overflowing of God's love and light. From the shadow can come knowing life. All right, one more point. If evil is the absence of good, a final corollary from what follows. Evil is self-defeating. In choosing to corrupt themselves by becoming less good, evil beings inevitably become less whole, less effective, less powerful. This does not mean, of course, that they are not very dangerous, and it is not wise for a mere man to take on even the most impotent demon unaided. Write that down in your notes. It's good to know. But in their malice, these evil creatures become ever less capable of challenging the forces of good. If you'll indulge me, I'll give another example from a previous writer, from Milton's Paradise Lost. Unlike Dante, who shows Satan in the ultimate state of impotence, Milton shows Satan just after his rebellion, when he is still a mighty seraph. Some readers have even thought that Milton unconsciously made Satan so attractive as to be the true hero of the epic. But those readers are less conscious than Milton. His intent was to show the gradual degeneration of Satan, and to show that Satan himself chooses to become a lesser being at each stage. To get past the angelic guards around earth, he disguises himself as a young cherub, a much lesser angel than he was. Later, he takes the shape of a large bird, a cormorant, in order to fly over the walls that surround Eden. Next, he goes to whisper evil thoughts in Eve's ear, and he disguises himself as a toad. And finally, of course, in order to tempt Eve, he presents himself in the shape of a serpent. So you can see the degeneration here. Now his self-corruption is complete. Naturally, he thinks he can easily regain his original powerful form, but he's wrong. When he returns to hell to announce his success in corrupting Adam and Eve, he expects to hear applause from his followers, but instead he hears a hiss, for they've all been turned into serpents. Milton brilliantly shows, I think, that these evil beings have deliberately chosen to be less than they were meant to be, and cannot go back, except by repentance, which they are less and less able to do as well. Tolkien presents us with many formidable evil creatures, but they always outdo themselves one way or another. The trolls encountered by Bilbo, for example, and the dwarves, are so given to argument and fighting amongst themselves that they start arguing about how to cook their captives. And with a little help from Gandalf, to be sure, before they know it, dawn catches them and they're turned to stone. But it's really their own argumentativeness that makes them vulnerable. Another instance, when Sam finds the great spider Shelob bending over Frodo, he grabs the elven blade and attacks, soon finding himself right under her and slashing at her underside. But her hide, we are told, is too tough to penetrate. Knobbed and pitted with corruption was her age-old hide, but ever thickened from within with layer on layer of evil growth, The blade scored it with a dreadful gash, but those hideous folds could not be pierced by any strength of men, nor though elf or dwarf should forge the steel, or the hand of Baron or of Turin wield it. She yielded to the stroke, and then heaved up the great bag of her belly high above Sam's head. Poison frothed and bubbled from the wound. Now, splaying her legs, she drove her huge bulk down on him again. Too soon. For Sam still stood upon his feet, and dropping his own sword, with both hands he held the elven blade point upwards, fending off that ghastly roof. And so she loved, with the driving force of her own cruel will, with strength greater than any warrior's hand, thrust herself upon a bitter spike. Deep, deep it pricked, as Sam was crushed slowly to the ground. The monster is undone by the driving force of her own cruel will, killing herself with her own strength in her malice. The evil figures are moved by pride, and consequently they do not expect to be defeated. They get a little overconfident, while the good are always humbly aware of their limitations, the way Tolkien presents them. Saruman overreaches and awakens a force too great for him in the forest on his doorstep. The Ents who have long slept become aware of Saruman's greed, because he cuts down the trees that are under their care, and they break his power. Then the Huorns, something between an Ent and a tree apparently, follow Saruman's forces to the battle against Rohan, where the orcs, driven back by Aragorn and Theoden and Gandalf, find themselves in a forest that appeared behind them overnight, from which not a single one of them escapes. The idea is that evil is self-defeating becomes explicit in the episode in which Aragorn calls the long-dead Oathbreakers to redeem themselves by serving him, and his host of ghostly warriors sweeps away the evil men who are gathering a fleet to give the final blow to Gondor. Legolas tells the story. Ere that dark day ended, none of the enemy were left to resist us. All were drowned, or were flying south in the hope to find their own lands upon foot. Strange and wonderful, I thought it, that the designs of Mordor should be overthrown by such wraiths of fear and darkness. With its own weapons was it worsted. Throughout Tolkien's works, this is the case. Evil beings bring about their own undoing, worsted with their own weapons. The Lord of the Nazgul is also self-defeating. Like Shakespeare's Macbeth, he foolishly trusts to a prophecy that says he cannot be killed by a living man. When he sits on his winged beast over the dying body of King Theoden and finds himself challenged by a lone soldier, he crows, "Thou fool, no living man may hinder me." But his opponent responds by laughing and proclaims, "But no living man am I. You look upon a woman. Eowyn I am, Eadmund's daughter." Then the ringwraith suddenly feels doubt. Merry begins to crawl toward him, but we're told the Black Captain, in doubt and malice intent upon the woman before him, heeded him no more than a worm in the mud. Another grave error, motivated by malice and pride. For Merry is able to stab him in the leg. Eowyn finishes him, and he returns to nothingness. And I think this is a beautiful description, powerful description. Then tottering, struggling up with her last strength, she drove her sword between crown and mantle, as the great shoulders bowed before her. The sword broke, sparkling into many shards. The crown rolled away with a clang. Eowyn fell forward upon her fallen foe. But lo, the mantle and hauberk were empty. Shapeless they lay now on the ground, torn and tumbled. And a cry went up into the shuddering air and faded to a shrill wailing, passing with the wind. A voice bodiless and thin that died and was swallowed up and was never heard again in that age of the world. It's pretty good writing. These wicked lords are truly powerful, yet they find themselves vulnerable to humble beings who act out of love and send them into the darkness. attacked by a hobbit and a woman warrior, the captain of the Wraiths suddenly loses what little shape he had, becoming merely a voice, bodiless, that dies out and is gone. Sauron himself is unexpectedly vulnerable as well. When Aragorn shows himself to the Dark Lord in the Palantir and is able to wrest control of it away from him, Sauron begins to doubt. Here's how Aragorn describes it. To know that I lived and walked the earth was a blow to his heart, I deem. For he knew it not till now. The eyes in Orthanc did not see through the armor of Theoden, but Sauron has not forgotten Isildur and the sword of Elendil. Now, in the very hour of his great designs, the heir of Isildur and the sword are revealed, for I showed the blade reforged to him. He is not so mighty yet that he is above fear. Nay, doubt ever gnaws him. Aragorn's last statement here is a telling one. Doubt ever gnaws at the heart of Sauron. His pride and cruelty are perhaps compensatory for the doubt he always feels. In response to Aragorn's appearance, the Dark Lord springs his trap too soon, before his forces are fully ready. Then, while his eye is focused on the war, he is not aware of two small hobbits stumbling and finally crawling toward Mount Doom. When Frodo stands before the crack of doom and puts on the ring, the Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, and his eye, piercing all shadows, looked across the plain to the door that he had made, and the magnitude of his own folly was revealed to him in a blinding flash, and all the devices of his enemies were at last laid bare. Then his wrath blazed in consuming flame, but his fear rose like a vast black smoke to choke him. For he knew his deadly peril and the thread upon which his doom now hung. This great and powerful Lord, full of disdain for his enemies, suddenly knows what a fool he has been, and his fiery wrath is overcome by the dark smoke of his fear. From where they stand before the gate to Mordor fighting a losing battle, the captains of the West realize that Sauron has been defeated. And as the captains gazed south to the land of Mordor, it seemed to them that black against the pall of cloud, there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Enormous, it reared above the world and stretched out towards them a vast, threatening hand, terrible but impotent. For even as it leaned over them, a great wind took it, and it was all blown away and passed, and then a hush fell. In the end, Tolkien tells us, evil is horrible but impotent, and it is blown away by the wind into the nothingness it has chosen. So much for the bad guys. I'll just say a few words now about the good characters. I've used up all my time talking about evil, but that is always the way of it, because bad things are perversely more interesting than good ones to us. Tolkien notes this odd reality himself early on in The Hobbit, when Bilbo and Gandalf and the dwarves have a rest in Elrond's wonderful house in the Valley of Rivendell. He says, "Now it is a strange thing," the narrator says, "but things that are good to have and days that are good to spend are soon told about, and not much to listen to. While things that are uncomfortable, palpitating, and even gruesome may make a good tale and take a good deal of telling anyway." So what I have to say about the forces of good in these tales may be said briefly, and has already been suggested. The evil forces seem overwhelmingly powerful, while the good characters are all unlikely heroes who are always aware of their own vulnerability. But their humility is in the end their strength. In fact, in many stories, the good characters are hidden away in lowly circumstances and often do not know that they will have a big role to play in the struggle. This common story element is sometimes called the lost royal child motif. In fairy tales, it's always the youngest son or daughter, the Cinderella type, who turns out to be the prince or princess. I'm the oldest child in my family, and I resent this prejudice against older children. We're very nice. And the young kids are just a bunch of punks. I don't know why they get all the good stories. But anyway, one well-known example of this lost royal child is King Arthur, who was spirited away by Merlin as a baby and raised secretly by a lesser knight, Sir Ector. His identity is revealed when he is able to pull the sword from the stone. And often there is some such sign of true nobility for the unlikely hero. Another example from the Bible is Moses, who's hidden in the rushes along the banks of the Nile and discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter. And of course, that story prefigures the greatest story of the unlikely hero, of the lost royal child, the Nativity of Christ, who is born into very humble circumstances and must be taken away to Egypt to hide him from Herod's soldiers who are sent to kill all Hebrew boy babies. This humble hero motif is universal, but it resonates particularly with Christianity, a religion that assures us that all people, no matter how limited in mind or body, may be saved. Again, in the early years of Christianity, there was a competing idea. For the Gnostics asserted that special knowledge held only by a few was necessary for salvation. This too was declared a heresy. There's no IQ test for salvation. You're probably already thinking of some other examples of these unlikely heroes, so I think this would be a good time to open it up and at first just see if people have some other examples of these kind of hidden or unlikely heroes, either from Tolkien or from other stories.
Luke Skywalker.
Absolutely. Luke Skywalker is a great example of it. And Princess Leia, too. Well, I guess she is a princess when we first meet her, but she doesn't know who her parents really are. Good. Yes?
Well, this unlikely hero sort of is a way of making storytelling more relatable, because if the hero is someone just like you or me, it makes you and me more relatable to the hero. You can stand in the hero's shoes pretty easily.
That's right, absolutely. And so even those of us who are older children feel that we're not, the most, we feel our own vulnerabilities, certainly, and so we all accept that role of the youngest child who's unlikely to be. There's a sense that each of us feels we have maybe aristocratic blood in us somewhere. I actually do, so. I mean, my father did some research and said we're descended from Macbeth. I'd like to go back and reclaim the throne. I'll take names of people who want to join my army after the lecture. Other examples or thoughts about it?
Lucy or Edmund?
Yeah, why not? These little children, all those little children in the Lewis stories are unlikely to be heroes and turn out to be kings and queens.
Charles Wallace and Madeline Lynn.
Absolutely. Charles Wallace, he's a great example. He can barely do anything, but he has these gifts.
Cindy Carton and Tale of Two Cities.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, now we're getting into some high culture examples. Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, Sidney Carton, good. Yes? Harry Potter, I know. We were just listening to The Goblet of Fire in the car on the way up. We're trying to catch up. I've finally gotten up to that episode of Harry Potter. Really behind the times here. And my students are always making fun of me. They will anyway, but that gives them more. Yeah, the Harry Potter definitely an unknown hero until you know who tries to kill him, and that doesn't work.
David and Gideon.
Pardon me?
David and Gideon.
Yeah, David and Gideon, sure. Really, the Bible's full of examples of this, isn't it? Always these unexpected leaders cropping up by the grace of God. Now, back to Tolkien, some examples in Tolkien. I suppose maybe it's too obvious and you're just hesitating to say it? Who are some of the unexpected or unlikely or hidden heroes in Tolkien? Samwise Gamgee, all the hobbits, of course, but Sam most of all. You know, and there's that wonderful scene where he's talking to Frodo about the stories, the old stories, and he says, "You'll be in those stories, Mr. Frodo," and Frodo says, "So will you." Well, there's the Return of the King. That's what's the name of that king? Strider. He's just a ranger in the north, and completely unknown. He's been hidden away, but he turns out to be the king of Gondor. So it's very similar to the Arthur story. Okay, well maybe that's you're probably thinking of other examples, but not mentioning them. It's a very common motif in storytelling. Partly because, as you said, we can relate to that because we all feel there's more to us than meets the eye. You know, there's something noble in me, I believe, and that's not pride necessarily. It's actually a true sense that I was made to be something.
Is this a theme that transcends Western and Christian culture?
Absolutely. Yeah, you find examples everywhere. Right? In fact, the Cinderella story is a good example because it's found in virtually every culture around the world, some version of it. And people argue, anthropologists argue as to whether it's transmitted from one culture to another or whether it grows up independently in separate cultures. I favor I don't think you can prove this, but I favor the independent theory because I think it's just a truth of human nature. It's an archetypal truth. Other thoughts that you have? Or questions? Don't start asking me now, warning, don't start asking me hard questions about obscure Tolkien characters. I'm not going to play that game.
This is probably just because there's all sorts of different types of characters, but in the Greek epics and stuff, such as the Odyssey, those were kings and noble warriors. I don't think they had humble upbringings or unexpected origins.
That's true. Very true.
But I guess by just Greek culture.
You can find, I can't think of one right now, but you can find stories like this in Greek mythology. But certainly Achilles is not a surprise, or Odysseus. These are known figures in their stories. When you get to Aeneas, maybe you get a little bit of a sense. If you know the Aeneid, he's a great warrior, a well-known figure in Troy, and he's the son of a goddess. Venus is his mother. So it's not as if nobody knows that there's anything special about him. But nobody, including Aeneas, knows his mission. It's given to him suddenly as Troy is falling. And he wants to go out and die in battle. And instead he's told, you have to leave, like going away almost like a coward. And because your mission is to found Rome, not just to die in this battle. So I think that it comes into play there. But you're right. There's certainly lots of stories of kings. Yeah.
Like the shadow of the First World War loom over Tolkien's work.
Well, as you know, he was in the war, and one of the those who survived, and he felt grateful for that. I'm told that he gained a tremendous respect during the war for the soldiers. He was an officer, of course, but the soldiers who served under him. And I think he says explicitly somewhere that they were the model for the hobbits and for Sam in particular. These uneducated but rock solid men. So the shadow of the war looms large, but I guess I jumped to the unlikely heroes part of it because he took a lot of inspiration from that. experience too. But, you know, everybody was shaken by that war. It was just when the Western civilization thought it had everything pretty much figured out. Yeah, things are just getting better and better. Everybody was taken up with this progressive foolishness. And, oh, yeah, things are better now. We have machine guns. We can kill lots of each other. It's just great. So Europe has never really recovered. I think that Europe never recovered its self-confidence after World War I, and then World War II just buried it even deeper. Maybe part of the problem today, when you're not sure that the Europeans, they'll come up, have a rally, je suis, what's his name, Shadowy. But I read somebody responding to that and saying, unless a culture is willing to fight, unless you're willing to fight for your culture, it'll die. And I'm not sure they're willing to fight for it anymore. They're not even willing to have children. That's a dying culture. I don't know. That was a gratuitous comment, but the shadow of World War I, 100 years later, I think is still looming over the Europeans. It didn't affect Americans in the same way, did it? Because it wasn't fought on our soil. We lost a lot of, our people lost a lot of people. But, yes.
What stories specific do you think influenced Tolkien when he wrote The Lord of the Rings?
Well, he was a language master. He was a philologist at Oxford, and he knew all these medieval languages. Old Finnish, Middle Finnish. I don't know how many languages he knew. That's not counting, of course, Hebrew and Greek and Latin and so on. But he specialized in these Germanic languages. And so he was probably most deeply influenced by the literature of the Middle Ages.